Alrighty, World History B students, Tree Hall here, and hopefully we're going to do a video in 15 minutes or less on imperialism. Now, the reason that I'm doing this video, the subject of Unit 1, as you might have noticed, is imperialism, and imperialism is one of the fundamental causes of World War I. It's also one of the things, it's one of the consequences of the nationalism that you see that ultimately will also cause World War I. So this ties into the Project 1 essay, which is an essay on how nationalism influenced the world. And it also ties into your lessons, and I'm going to make another video in Unit 2 just distinctly on nationalism, and it'll tie into this. So before I begin and get into these really fast little kind of update here, if you look, and we're going to look at this picture again at the end, this is a picture of the world in 1908, and one of the things you're going to notice is a very large chunk of the world, most of the world, is owned by industrialized nations. And it would even look worse if we actually circled Latin America and Central America, which were not outright owned by the United States, because, you know, we had been a colony, we didn't do colonization, but were in fact controlled by the United States, so they might as well have been colonies in China as well. So on the eve of World War I, we got to this weird place. In our lessons, in our curriculum, was called New Imperialism, but there wasn't really much new about it. It was a place where basically the industrialized nations of the earth completely controlled most of the planet, and that is going to ultimately kind of blow up on them and cause World War I. So let's move into this. So first of all, I want to explain why I'm doing this. This is the essay topic you're going to see and write about for Project 1. You will also do a fact list for this that will directly be involved with imperialism. And so I want you to be thinking about this even now as you go through each of your lessons. In Project 1, you'll be required to write a detailed essay of 600 or more words explaining how nationalism changed the world during the 19th and early 20th centuries. In your essay, you will need to describe how nationalism influenced imperialism, political changes during the era, and World War I. So these are the things you're going to be writing about, and right now we're dealing with one of those. We're dealing with imperialism. Now, what is imperialism? Well, let's go back to the beginning. Now, so first of all, right around 1775 or so, 1750, Britain began to industrialize, and that's a story, a lengthy story by itself, but I'll tell you what's really kind of interesting that a lot of people don't know. One thing caused the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was all about trying to make something quicker, and what is interesting when you actually study the history of it, the Industrial Revolution begins in the textile industry, the clothes that we're wearing on our back, and one material causes the Industrial Revolution. As Britain began to set up colonies over in America and in India, they discovered cotton. And at the time that they were doing this, all the people in Europe wore clothing. There were two types of cloth that they used in Europe. Wool, which is itchy and scratchy, but it's warm, and linen, which is not itchy and scratchy, but I don't know if you've even ever dealt with linen. Linen is a lot like cotton, but you cannot get wrinkles out. It is so hard to keep linen unwrinkled. It's a very wrinkly clothing. So when cotton was discovered, they could not make cotton clothing fast enough. Basically, every piece of cotton clothing that was made, and again, it's Britain that starts this, every piece of cotton clothing was sold the minute it hit the market, and essentially by 1775, the British are going, how can we make cotton quicker? And that begins the Industrial Revolution. And what it means to be industrialized is machines, not human beings, are making things. Yes, human beings are working on those machines, but you basically have mechanized production, which means that you can produce things so much faster. And what you're looking at over on the left under this Industrial Revolution thing, that is a picture of the world's first industrial city, that is Manchester, which at the time was the center of textile activity on the planet. In about 1825, 7 or 8 of every piece of cotton clothing that people were wearing on our planet, 7, 8 out of 10, was made here in Manchester. So this was a serious industrial city. Now, what happens with the Industrial Revolution, it starts in Britain, and by 1825, Britain is heavily industrialized. By the way, let me fill in a little bit. Once they figure out how to make clothing faster, then all of a sudden they begin to apply that for everything else. You make your tools, you mass produce them. You make your heavy, your metals, your steam engines, all of that is industrialization until you have what is something like our modern society. And ultimately what that does, there's two things. It really drives down the price of goods, and it also makes goods, it really increases the volume of those goods. That's going to become important later as we talk about spread of industrial countries, because one of the things that gets industrialized is the weapons industry. And an industrial country can make a lot more weapons than a non-industrial country, which gives them a huge edge if they fight a war against a non-industrial country. Moving along. By 1825, Great Britain is the first place. That also played a huge role in Britain defeating Napoleon. In your lessons, you begin to read about Napoleon, and he fielded army after army. He defeated army after army after army, but every time he would whoop these guys, they would rebuild a new army. Who financed it? Great Britain. How did they finance it? They were industrial. So by 1830, industrialization had spread outside of Great Britain, and U.S. and Belgium are industrialized. By the way, for the U.S. being industrialized, you're not going to see a huge effect of that until the 1880s once we've got the whole country, right? But it was already happening even in the 1830s. And back then, if you stole the plans for factories, that was punishable by death, but people did it anyway, and they left. By the way, you might say Belgium, that's a strange place. Well, Belgium also made a lot of clothing, so it makes sense that they were number two along with us. We also made a lot of clothing because here's what was happening in the U.S. We're shipping the British every bit of cotton that we make, and at some point somebody starts scratching their head and they're saying, I think those British people made a lot of money off that cotton. How can we do this? And we began to industrialize. By 1860, most of Europe is industrialized, not including Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and Eastern Europe. That's going to play a role in World War I, so we'll come back to that. By 1880, Japan was industrialized, and that was because of the United States. We actually showed up. For 300 years, the Japanese refused to have contact with anybody in the outside world until one day we showed up with a whole fleet of ships and did some war exercises, in quotes, outside of Tokyo Harbor. And we said, we're not coming to ask you to trade, we're telling you. And they began to trade, but they also decided that they would modernize. And by 1880, Japan is one of the industrial powers. And the reason I show you the spread of the revolution, sometimes in modern times you'll hear of the G8 or the G11. The G stands for great. And you hear about that in the context of global economic meetings. These are also the most powerful and the most industrial and richest countries in the world. Japan is included even early on. So that's something to understand. So is America. So this is basically a European club except for America and Japan. They're in that too. So moving along, I want to talk about the spread or how industrialization ends up becoming imperialism. So over on the left, you see a picture of Shaka Zulu. He was a really powerful African chieftain in the early 19th century. And the reason he's important is because Europeans were having increasing contact with Africans and other non-industrialized peoples during this time. And remember how I just told you that all of industrialization centered around textile manufacturing? If I am a very rich textile manufacturer who has made so many shirts that at this point there's hardly any Europeans that need my new shirts, when I see a picture of Shaka Zulu, the first thing I notice is that he's almost naked, and I say to myself, there's a man who needs a shirt that is made in Manchester. That's how I see that picture. And I'm using the picture as kind of a symbol. The industrialized nations needed markets for their materials. At some point, when you industrialize, you're making things so fast that at some point you're going to saturate the market and you can't make any more, because that by about 1825, the textile manufacturers began to notice that Europeans and Americans were buying less shirts, not because we didn't like the cotton shirts, but because we already had a whole bunch in our closet. And so they began to look to places where they needed cotton shirts. And I'm just using cotton shirt as one example. There were many mechanized industries. And so when an industrial country looks at another country that's non-industrial, they see two things. They see some raw resources that they could use that non-industrial country is not using, like iron ore and other stuff that could go in factories that the non-industrial country doesn't have. They also see the non-industrial country as a market for their products. Keep in mind, industrial products are cheaper than non-industrial products. If you buy a shirt that was made in a factory by machines, it's going to cost you a fraction of a shirt that somebody homespun. Because can you imagine how much time it takes to homespin one of these? So anyway, they look at that and they say that is a potential market. And they begin to look outside of the industrial world and increasingly at other countries that are non-industrial. At the same time this is happening, these industrial companies are also using industrial techniques to make weapons. You can see a bunch of 19th century rifles over on the right. Now, what this means, if you're in a country that can make 1 million rifles a day, I don't even know what they really made, but I'm just saying, and you go to war against a country that's making rifles by hand, and they can't make even close to that, the outcome of that war is kind of inevitable. You're going to win. So what ends up happening with industrialization is we get into this kind of weird, unique situation that hasn't happened for a long time, maybe never happened, where suddenly you had a few countries, Britain, America, Japan, France, Austria, Germany, Belgium, the Netherlands, where they are just so much more powerful than the rest of the world that it's kind of hard not to take them over. Plus, they're looking at all those people with no shirts, and they're saying, these people need help. And so they begin to take over, and that is how industrialization leads to imperialism. When you industrialize, you need to reach out and acquire new markets and new materials. And this wasn't really an equality thing. They couldn't be stopped. Okay, now let's move along. So this is, I can't really tell what the date down here says. So this is imperialism pre-1850. Obviously, the British already had colonies. We know we used to be one, and we rebelled. So you can see that the British have some colonies. You can see that Denmark has a few colonies. Russia, pre-1850, Russia spent a long time expanding over their own continent. Even now, when you see that big purple thing, it looks like Russia's the most powerful country in the world, but keep in mind most of that is an empty forest. And Russia had more population than in some places, but their imperialism was over their own people necessarily. You'll notice that South America is untouched, Mexico's untouched, Africa's untouched, or just the edges of Africa, because people have been going around Africa for spices for a few centuries at this point, but they had never penetrated Africa. They really didn't have an interest in doing that. India is kind of in the middle, and you can see these different areas. So that is, you can see the beginnings of industrialization prior to 1850. Now I'm going to switch gears to a different map. This is industrialization 1913. Hang on for a sec. Okay, good. That's what I thought. We're going to come back to this too. This is industrialization 1913, and you can see that at this point, Africa has been totally taken over. You can see India is completely taken over, so is French Indochina. You can see that Indonesia and Australia are taken over. The only places that remain untaken over are South and Central America. Again, that's with an asterisk. We'll talk about that in a second. And China, and a little bit of the Middle East. And by the way, some of those areas in the Middle East that weren't taken over, that's just because nobody really wanted to take them over. And then what becomes more important, I guess I should move in here. Hey, it didn't work. Let me do this. Whoa. Sorry about that. Oh, my little thing isn't working. So, a part of Eastern Europe hasn't been taken over again, but that's another story, and I will tell that story a little later in a different unit. So, let me see if that's going to work. Sorry, it's driving me crazy that isn't working. I do okay. And it still isn't working. Okay, never mind. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Some of the chapters of imperialism, some of the more famous or infamous chapters, one was what they called the scramble for Africa, And this was 1880 to 1914, and you can see that this is a picture of Africa by 1914. And some of the big moments in that, they did a Berlin conference of 1885, then they revisited that conference a little later. There were two conferences in Berlin where basically they divided the country of Africa. And what was interesting is they didn't ever invite any Africans to that conference. You can notice that every country in Africa, it belongs to somewhere in Europe. And that has caused trouble in Africa to this day, by the way, because they kind of ignored the people that were there. When you look at these borders, these were drawn around resources, not people. So I'll just give you an example. Belgian Congo, you might have heard about the Rwandan genocide. Rwanda is somewhere in this. What they did basically is they took two groups of people, the Hutus and the Tutsis, who traditionally had hated each other, and they chucked them in the same country, and that didn't really produce that great of results. And that's happened all throughout Africa, so that's one of the reasons why Africa has had so many troubles to this day. But anyway, this is the scramble for Africa, and you can see in a very rapid time, all of those countries were taken over. This is imperialism in Asia from the 1820s to 1910. What happened with India is Britain had originally traded with India, and they were kind of on even footing. But gradually, when Britain arrived in India, and this is way back in the 1750s, India was not one united country. It was probably about 300 little countries inside that subcontinent. And the British gradually came to control a mercenary army of Indian people they called the Sepoys, and they gradually took control of this. And then there was this huge rebellion, I think in 1848 or something. It was sometime in the 19th century. At some point, the Sepoys said, okay, wait a minute, we're trying to figure this out. We've taken over India for the British, and we do all the fighting, and the British get all the money and all the glory. How's this working? And there was this huge rebellion, and the British at that point were so tied in with India economically that they sent their army in, and from that point on, India becomes an outright colony of Britain. You can see, and this will become important later on when we study the Vietnam War, France takes over Indochina, which is later Vietnam. Again, Dutch East Indies. You can see the Philippines are controlled by who? The United States. We actually fought a war against Spain, and we stole Spain's colonies. So don't think that we were innocent in this. Which reminds me, so that comes back to the Monroe Doctrine. Another chapter of imperialism is the Monroe Doctrine, which this is a wonderful picture of. In 1820, we drew a line over South America and Central America and the Western Hemisphere, and we said, you can't touch this, you can't recolonize this. We did this right after many of the nations of Latin America declared themselves independent from Spain and whoever else ruled them. So at the time, we were such a pathetic little power that the rest of the world kind of laughed at us, but Britain had a lot of interest in this because Britain was already trading super extensively with the United States, and they realized that if the U.S. kind of controlled this area, then that would increase their trade. And they even said, they came to us and they said, we will help you enforce this if you give us a piece of the action. And so even though America doesn't really take colonies during this time, we basically control who's in power in Latin America, and we kind of forced those governments to not industrialize and depend on the United States. So we were not innocent in this either. We were just like any other industrial power. We were controlling. The difference was we were doing this with a little more finesse. We didn't outright control them. If you ever want to hear that story, there's two words that will explain this. That you can look up the term caudillo, and that talks about rulers of Latin America that weren't very good guys that we supported. And you can look up the term the banana republic. And what a banana republic is, obviously this would concern bananas, it's a country where we have forced them to be, or basically kept the people in control that make them depend on one product, like bananas, or in the case of Colombia, coffee, and they don't industrialize. Well, the people that live in that country still need industrial goods, so they buy all of their products from the U.S., and we buy up all their bananas and their coffee, but it's a better trade arrangement for us than them. So that is another chapter in this, and now let's move to the final chapter, China. China had been a very, very powerful nation, and this is something to understand about China. Even then, China was the biggest country in the world when it comes to population, so they didn't get outright colonized. There was just so many Chinese people that no one could really control them. Plus, they were a pretty large area. China fell into a civil war in the early 1840s, and then another really bad one. It was a really bad one just before our Civil War, and they killed millions of people. And it kind of collapsed their government, and then the industrial powers swoop in. Now, this is something that's really interesting. You might notice that Japan is now playing a role in the imperial game. So the European and American powers, and by the way, we enforced this. We called this the open door policy. This was something that was enforced by the United States. We made this deal. We said no one can colonize China outright, but every country can trade with China if they want to, because this is a good thing, and we will force that trade. We will make it happen. So you can see China is on here too. So those are really kind of the chapters of imperialism. Again, in our lessons, this is all called new imperialism. I just call it imperialism. Now let's talk about some different kind of aspects of this, because I want you to understand the nature of imperialism. So here is one. Let me see. Do I have? Yep, I do have the other. I want to start with this one. So these are just some common cartoons. If you look this up on the internet and you Google image imperialism, you will find some of these cartoons, one of which is in our lesson. So here's the first one. Maybe more than one, I don't know. The first one shows England over on the left, and it's like an octopus, and you can see that it's reaching out everywhere. That's a picture of industrialization and that need for constantly expanding markets and constantly expanding raw materials. Now, in the picture, you can see that's England. And by the way, England was by far the most successful imperial colonial power. Nobody beats England. But really, this was true of any industrial nation. We were all of these industrial economies were reaching out and trying to expand their markets and grab more raw materials. And that is kind of an example of that relationship between the master country and the colony country. It's not a fair or even relationship. Picture on the right is a picture of a fellow named Cecil Rhodes, who was, as you can see, in the British military. He's got the uniform on. He later left the military to become a diamond miner and eventually would control De Beers Mining. And basically, this is a company that still to this day controls most of the diamonds on the planet, has a very heavy presence in Africa, specifically South Africa. And there was a time when the nation of Uganda and part of South Africa was all called Rhodesia, named after Cecil Rhodes. And there's an ancient, if you study ancient world history, one of the 7 wonders of the world was the Colossus of Rhodes. Rhodes was a city-state of the ancient Greeks, and the legend has it, it's all gone now, but as you came into that city, they had this enormous statue that was so big that it stood over the harbor. The legs were over the harbor. You had to go underneath it. It was this huge statue. That was the Colossus of Rhodes. So the people that made this cartoon spelt it a little differently, and they called this the Colossus of Rhodes. And what you can see is that Cecil Rhodes, one man, is standing over the entire continent of South Africa. That also is a good depiction of imperialism, because there were certain people who became very rich and very powerful based on imperialism and had a lot more power than other people, especially the ones who lived there. Generally, the industrialized countries did not really respect the rights of the non-industrial countries here. They were concerned with themselves first and their colonists later, which is why when we were a colony, we rebelled. We didn't like it. We didn't think it was a very fair system. Pictures here, this is later colonialism, and so the picture on the left here is a picture that you'll often find associated with the open door policy. That was the policy that allowed industrial countries to create these spheres of influence in Japan, and in China. Now you'll notice in this cartoon that China is represented by it looks like a pizza or a pie, and you can see that all these different countries are splitting up the pie. You can clearly recognize the British Queen. You can see the German Emperor. The guy with the funny hat is Russia. The girl is France, and you can even see Japan, and they're all sitting over it. Now China's represented by a person too. He's the guy in the back waving his hand, stop. But you'll notice no one is listening to him. That also is a good representation of imperialism. We didn't ask, we took. Now, if you look over here on the right, this is the cartoon we have in our lessons that says the real trouble is going to come with the wake. Now, this is one I notice a lot of you guys kind of maybe didn't quite totally catch the message on in the cartoon, in the discussion. So I'll talk about this. You can see all the same countries are represented here. You see Russia, you can see Great Britain, you can see us with, you can see us in the back with our little, bald eagle. So everybody's there, and just like the other one, you can notice that in the picture on the left, everybody's got a mean look. They're not looking at each other happily. These guys are even worse. They look like they're about to come to blows. That's the trouble. Of course, here's what's interesting. What are they fighting over? They're fighting over this China, but the China is not dead. It's asleep. And what is interesting about this cartoon, and I thought I'd leave us with this, China is represented as a sleeping dragon. Now, if you think about the order of animals, bear trumps rabbit, lion trumps, donkey, dragon trumps all. And so what they're really saying is someday China's going to wake up and it's not going to tolerate you guys with your little dopey spheres of influence, and you guys are going to have a real problem on your hands because China's home to a third of the planet's population, and you can't take them over for long. Okay, so that's a good picture. And again, I'll end with that because that is how imperialism was. It benefited certain groups, but it really came at a cost to others. And ultimately, it was not something that was really destined to last forever. Okay, now, let me finish with the effects of imperialism because it wasn't all bad. And I really urge you guys, as you get into Unit 1 documentary, I might even have brought this into Unit 2, I watched a few films on imperialism that were made by a British guy, and he calls the films Empire. So if you see those, they were actually really good because one of the things that he did in the films, he talked about all the bad things that had happened, but he also, everywhere he went, he would ask the people that lived there. He went to all these former British colonies. He would say, well, so let me ask you something. Are you angry at the British? Do you have any resentment? And the funny thing was, nobody ever said yes. They would always go, no, that was just part of our history, and we're past that now. Yeah, we didn't want them to rule us forever, but they did some good things as well. And so I wanted to kind of talk about the good and the bad of imperialism. The good, it was an expansion of global trade. The age of imperialism caused nations to trade with each other as they had never done before. It just accelerated that, and that is good, which kind of also leads to that second one, increased interaction between nations throughout the globe. Truly was an era of globalization. Also, you see infrastructure and economic investment in non-industrial nations. If you see a train track in India, it was built by the British. If you see a train track that was in Africa, it was probably built by the British. There was a lot of infrastructure investment. And sure, these industrial countries weren't really doing it for the countries they took over, but it benefited them anyway. So it kind of kick-started economies of non-industrial countries, many of which today are very industrial. China's the most industrial place on earth, and India's up there too. So that you could say that imperialism helped that. It also spread culture throughout the globe. Both the culture of the master nations and the culture of the colony nations, both cultures were influenced, and so it did that. Now, bad effects of imperialism. First, and probably biggest, I'm going to bring you to the tail ends of this because they go hand in hand. It inflated heads throughout Europe. What does it mean when our head gets big? It means we are thinking we are so cool and we are so awesome, and all of the good things that are happening to us is coming because of us. If you want to see an example of that, and that brings me to increased racism and resentment due to colonial policies, read the poem White Man's Burden. Now, what's interesting with that poem, if you read carefully, it's meant to be a warning. The guy that wrote it really didn't mean what he's saying. He's being really arrogant and kind of sarcastic. But he points out, really, this time of imperialism, this was probably one of the most racist times in world history. Like the Romans, they never cared if somebody was black or white. That was not a big thing. But at this time, oh my goodness, white was right, and Europeans were the best, and everybody else was the rest. And of course, the Japanese just looked at it differently. The Japanese are the best, and everybody else is the rest. But definitely a time of inflated heads, and this will be one of the main causes of World War I. When World War I began, everybody thought, oh, war might be kind of cool. I could get a little scar, show it to the girlfriend. Well, of course we're going to win against the other people we're fighting against. They're fools, and we're not. And so this kind of leads to this inflated head syndrome. 2, colonial economics. What does that mean? When you colonized a country, an imperial nation didn't have a whole lot of interest in that country trading with anybody other than them. Let's go back to American when we were a colony of Great Britain. One of the biggest reasons we rebelled against Great Britain was not because they had bad laws, but because we wanted to trade with everybody on the planet. We were trying to grow our economy, and we just said, hey, if somebody wants to buy American, we want to sell it to them. And Britain was like, well, no, you just sell to us, we sell to you, and don't make anything manufactured, by the way. We'll supply you with that stuff. You just keep giving us that cotton. That's what we really want. And we didn't like it. Well, we didn't like it, and neither did any of the other countries that got colonized that eventually, by 1960, takes a long time, but by 1960, there's no more colonies. World War II, when everybody saw that the colonial powers were down and out, they went out and they rebelled, and there's no colonies today. And one of the big drivers of that is colonial economics. This also has another connection to World War I. Some countries took a while to get their act together. The newest country in Europe by the time of World War I was the country of Germany. Germany has not even become a nation until like 1872. It's a really new country. There's always been a Germany, but it wasn't united like the Germany that we see today. And because it took them so long to kind of get their act together, Germany had this, they were industrial, they had this growing economy, and they had nobody to trade with because they didn't own any colonies, because when, the scramble for Africa and all that all happened before their time. They did get a couple colonies in Africa. That's why they held the conferences in Berlin, to get a little piece of the action. But they were late comers to the table. Russia is another late comer to the table, and that means that they are kind of in a closed economic system, and that is going to cause them to be open to something like World War I, because they need a change. What the status quo isn't working for them because they don't have colonies. Limited opportunities for colonial peoples. One of the interesting effects of imperialism is they had to educate the local people to run the local systems. And so you actually would have people that would come from India and go to Britain to go to college and then go back to India, and they were only ever a second-class citizen. Or people in Vietnam who were educated, but they could only go so far. And they couldn't get any further. I know I keep using America, but a great example. I've got a show that I used to use on the American Revolution that talked about what our founding fathers were doing before the Revolution, and almost every one of our founding fathers had tried to become an English official and only got so far, and then they were like, well, you weren't really born in Britain, you are an American, and they were kind of shoved down, and that left a bad taste in the mouth of the people in the colonies. There was also an increased competition between industrialized nations for resources and markets. The Europeans often referred to imperialism as the great game. Now, this is a little scary because people like to win games, right? And this was a game, this was a competition for resources and markets, and it was basically, here was the interesting thing, it was like the nations of Europe were at war with each other, but not on the continent. Out there in the rest of the world, they fought each other tooth and nail over these resources. And so ultimately what ended up happening is they fought, and eventually that fight would come to the European continent, and it would absolutely destroy those countries. So that's going to come later. Increased racism and resentment due to colonial policies, and that kind of comes back to this. So hopefully I did this video in 15 minutes or under. Hopefully. I don't talk. I know I talk a lot. Sorry. But anyway, that's kind of a little bit of the everything in a nutshell concerning imperialism. If you watch this, you can get credit for it for the Unit 1 video. The instructions will be in Google Classroom. Or you can just watch it just to give you kind of the backstory. As you're reading these lessons, sometimes you miss that bigger picture story. So I wanted you to kind of have that bigger picture on imperialism. Thank you for listening to my little show. And if you need anything, please let me know, and I'm happy to help.